Welcome to the Alisa Childers podcast, where we equip Christians to identify the core beliefs of historic Christianity, discern its counterfeits, and proclaim the gospel with clarity, kindness, and truth. And I've just gotten off a call with Jesse and Kaylee Westwood, who shared their powerful story of being raised up within that Bethel church culture. And if you're unfamiliar, Bethel is one of the most famous churches in America. Many churches are singing their songs on Sunday, and many Christians are unaware of the theology that undergirds so much of the songs that we're singing on Sunday. So just as a starting point, what I'd love for everyone to do, and I mentioned this last week, is watch Mike Winger's video that analyzes Bethel theology, because that will be very eye-opening, I think, if you're unaware of what Bethel teaches. But they were raised up within that culture. They're worship leaders, touring with people like Sean Foyt, and really rising to prominence in that culture. And ultimately, Jesse deconstructed into atheism, stayed an atheist for about a year before he reconstructed to historic Christianity. For Kaylee, her journey looked a little bit more like doubting a lot of the paradigm that she'd been taught, really building a theology for the first time, because she didn't really have a theology or a theological paradigm to draw from. And their story is just so powerful. One of the most powerful moments for me was when Kaylee shared the sad story of her brother passing away from a head injury, and a team called the Dead Raising Team was invited to the hospital to try to raise him from the dead. And if you missed last week's episode, I want to encourage you to go listen to that. I analyzed and reviewed a book called How to Raise the Dead that explains the theology behind really everything that is taught in this kind of culture about Christians being able to perform miracles, and not even just being able to perform miracles, but the claim that performing miracles, including things like levitating, raising people from the dead, and living immortal lives here on earth, like never dying. This is what's taught in this book. The outflow and the outcome of that theology, Kaylee shared what that was like for her, how that shook her faith, how that particular theology was so damaging because it's unbiblical and because it's untrue. And so I think their story is going to give you a lot of insight into that culture. And if you maybe are sympathetic to Bethel and Bethel culture, I want to invite you to keep an open mind, because the Westwoods love Bethel. They love a lot of the people there. They're not anti anybody. They're not saying anybody's not a Christian, but they want to share their story of coming out of that paradigm and then constructing a view that was based on a more biblical view of God and salvation. And so I just want to encourage everybody to keep an open mind and listen to their story, because it really touched me and helped me learn even more about what's going on in that world. So without any further ado, here are the Westwoods. Well, Jesse and Kaylee, thank you so much for coming on here. Jesse, we were supposed to do an episode, I think almost a year and a half ago, when the
Yeah.
Asbury, sort of what they were calling the Asbury revival, broke out. And I had made a video just asking some questions, kind of thinking, okay, like, let's think about what revival is and what the fruit of revival would be. And then because of your story, I wanted to do a live stream with you about why, just explaining to people why some of us were a little bit skeptical of even what is being called revival culture. And of course, your background being a graduate of the Bethel School of Supernatural Ministry and being a worship leader in that world. And then you and your wife, Kaylee, end up walking away from that whole world. And I want to talk about that story today. It involves a bit of a, Jesse, deconstruction on your part.
Mhm.
And so, Jesse, let's just start with you. Tell us your story. When did you get saved? When did you come to Bethel? And how did you get involved with the music there? And we'll just take it from there.
Yeah. So I grew up going to a church about 2 miles from my house here. Charismatic church, great people. Born and raised there, and early age got onto the stage playing saxophone, helping out with worship. I couldn't really tell you when I got saved. It's one of those things. I just grew up in the church. If you asked me that now, I'd probably say about 2 years ago. I think I got
Okay.
saved.
Yeah.
Uh, but yeah, I just grew up in the church, so I didn't really have a crazy testimony. It was just, church kid, and got on the stage as quick as I could. About 12 years old, I was playing saxophone. And then from there, they needed a bass player. And then from there, they needed a singer and an acoustic guitarist. So I just kept picking things up as it needed. And by the time I got to high school, I was leading worship pretty regularly there. And as far as Bethel goes, a couple leaders from my church went down to Lakeland for the revival that was happening down in Florida. And they came across some Bethel students. And I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do for college. And my parents' big thing was like, they said, just don't waste time, right? Like, just do something. And so Bethel came up as an option. And at the time, it was only like $3,000 to do a school year at Bethel, so that was very feasible. And I went out to Reading. I never heard a Bethel sermon. I never heard Bill Johnson speak. I never even heard Jesus Culture album. It was just I was told these people are doing what our church does, but better. And so I thought that sounds like a good idea.
Yeah.
So and from there going to Bethel, it was just everything I hoped for. Prophetic words and prophetic training, and learning how to pray for miracles and healings and treasure hunts and just all the works.
So
Um,
I have to admit that I also played the saxophone when I was about 12 or 11. I think I was in
no.
fifth grade. Oh, yeah. I was all about the sax. I played for 1 year and that was it. But I really did
That's
get into
awesome.
that. It was a big thing for a while, the saxophone. So very cool. So I want to ask you a little bit more details about your experience at the school because,
Mhm.
you hear so many different things. What did you learn? You just said treasure hunts. I don't know what that is, so maybe you can tell us what a
Mhm.
treasure hunt is. But tell us some of the other things you learn. I do understand that at this school, people are taught, apparently to perform miracles and things like that. So
Mhm.
maybe start with treasure hunts and let us know, what did you learn at
Yeah.
Bethel?
Yeah. So you really could break down the school each year into kind of three main themes. So the first year is all about identity and who you are in Christ, and you kind of go through Chris Valentin's supernatural ways of royalty. So it's all about royalty and identity and leaving a pauper mentality behind and knowing how amazing you are. And in that, we do treasure hunts, and treasure hunts segues into that perfectly because it's the idea how everyone is a treasure and how we're supposed to go out and find that treasure. And so a treasure hunt essentially, in the most layman terms, is like a Christian Mad Lib. So basically, you have like a piece of paper with 5 slots for names, 5 slots for locations, 5 slots for clothing, 5 slots for uh, ailments, 5 slots for random stuff. And you get together and you're in the fireside room at Bethel after worship on Friday night, and then you fill it out, you pray, or ideally you're getting a prophetic word from God about who and what you're supposed to come across. And you get with your group and you see, let's say you, me, and Kaylee were on a treasure hunt together, and let's say we all had Sundial Bridge, which everyone always had Sundial Bridge because it's Reading.
Hmm.
And so you all decide, well, God's telling us to go to Sundial Bridge. And then you all look at your names, like, oh, we all have the name Tom. So we're looking for someone named Tom at Sundial Bridge. Let's say we all had red, or I don't know, like a Philadelphia Eagles or something like that. So we're looking for someone at Sundial Bridge named Tom with a red shirt and a Philadelphia Eagles logo. And then let's say you come across that person, and then you say, hey, like, you're God's treasure. You're the person that God wants us to come across. Do you have one of these ailments? And you go through the list. And
Mm,
let's say they have a hurt knee. Well, God brought us here because he wants us to pray for your hurt knee. You pray for that hurt knee, hope they feel something, and you say thank you, and you would go along your way. Um, that was a treasure hunt. We weren't really trained to share the gospel or anything like that. It was mainly just the miracle encounter.
hmm. Okay, I have some questions about that. So, first of all, how often were all of the things accurate? And what would be the bar you would settle for? So, like, let's say you had the name Tom, blue shirt, Philadelphia Eagles, ailments. Let's say you found a guy in a blue shirt that had an Eagles hat on, but his name was Scott.
Yeah,
What would you do with that?
you nailed it. It's like that. That's it. You got it. I mean,
So,
it wasn't really how much, it was if any.
if
And
any of the
so
things they had, yeah. Okay. So
yeah,
there's
the
kind of a
more
low
the
bar
more the
of
better, obviously. Yeah.
yeah, but so there's kind of a low bar for accuracy, perhaps.
Mhm.
And it was
Yeah.
interesting you said you weren't trained to share the gospel. Were you trained in the
Right.
gospel at Bethel School?
I mean, that's the thing. It's like if you ask anyone there, they'll tell you yes. But I can tell as not only someone who went to treasure hunts, but also led treasure hunts. So, like I said, first year is all about identity, who you are. And then second year is about taking that fire, taking revival to your church or wherever you go. So, second year is more of a leadership capacity. And you're doing a lot of leadership with the first year students. So, as a second year student, I led and taught treasure hunts. And so there was no basis. It's off of Kevin Dedman's book, which is Finding God's Treasure, or Treasure, I forget what it's called, but he was one of the head evangelists at Bethel next to Chris Overstreet. And we went off of his book, and there was no emphasis on really sharing the gospel. The gospel message to them was that God loves you, God cares about you, and he wants you to know that he loves you. Right? That was the gospel message that I if you ask me to share it, that's what I would have shared to people at the time.
Mm.
So yeah, that's what we were basically pushed to tell.
That's interesting because in last week's podcast, I reviewed a book called How to Raise the Dead by Tyler Johnson, and he is also a Bethel alum. And it was interesting how much of that theology that you're describing right now lines up with what was in the book. Because when he
Yeah.
talks about really how you receive faith and is to really fully realize God's love, you have to realize, and the idea wasn't so much that you're trying to grasp the attributes of God and behold his holiness and his
Mhm.
omnipotence and his perfect justice and mercy, where the Bible says mercy and justice kiss. It's like they're not in contradiction to one another. But in this book, it was like anything that you think is bad, well, God wouldn't do that. So it's really just kind
Mhm.
of this self-styled idea of God, of love, of goodness. And that was kind of the gospel. You just have to realize how much God is in. He said, God doesn't just love you, he's in love with you.
Yep.
And, don't let shame sever that. You just have to realize. And that to me, in my work with progressive Christianity, is so similar. It's so similar to progressive Christianity in that it de-emphasizes, well, progressive Christianity, I would say, ultimately denies the gospel, where maybe
Mhm.
Bethel people would affirm the gospel on paper.
Yeah.
But the
Yeah.
emphasis really tends to be more on
Yes.
me. It sounds like it's a real me-centered theology. Do you think that's an
Right.
accurate summary?
Yeah, and I do get a little, I don't wanna say offended, but frustrated because I never like a you're the same way. You talk about making steel man arguments, right? We wanna make sure whatever argument we're coming against is a good one,
Hmm.
and we understand it. And that's honestly one of the ways people straw man Bethel a lot is they say, "Well, they don't know the gospel, they don't share the gospel." It's like, well, they do know the gospel, and you can find many a sermons where they share it. The emphasis, though, is on it's lopsided. It's a very
Hmm.
me-centered. Like, a great example was, like, on treasure hunts. I remember in particular, there was one time we went out and, essentially, I had, like, Gothic style on my clothing as someone I was picturing in my mind, my prophecy I was getting. I was picturing someone, like, in Gothic attire, and, I was at Starbucks, and we found this girl in Gothic attire at Starbucks, and, the one of the first-year students felt like they had a word for him. Like, "Yeah, go give the word." And they give the word. And as a second year, I'm supposed to vet the words. Okay, what are you going to tell them? I didn't want, the rule at Bethel was no dates, no mates, no babies. So I didn't want you to like, come say in 2 days you're going to get married and have a kid. We
Yeah.
didn't want anyone getting that kind of word. But the word they told me they're going to give him was like, hey, God loves you and he's very happy with where you're at and he cares for you. He's excited for this next season of your life. I'm like, oh, that's a good word. Or the first year student goes gives this word to this girl, and she goes, "That's awesome! Like I just started practicing Wicca. I feel like God's really starting to like talk to me more." And I'm just like, that backfired real quick because
Wow.
the whole point is you're saying God wanted me to find you and call you out and give you this message, and the message is keep practicing Wicca,
Mm.
essentially,
Wow.
because you're
Yeah.
saying God loves you, He loves where you're at, He's excited for this new next season of your life.
Yeah.
That doesn't work, right? And so that's like the gospel clearly wasn't shared, but in their attempt with the emphasis for where the gospel was at, you end up shooting yourself in the foot.
So let me ask you about the prophecy element at Bethel.
Yeah.
So you said no dates, no mates, no babies. What I'm
Yeah.
curious about is how Bethel defines prophecy, because if they're going to define prophecy as maybe a word that the Lord would give you for another person, what's the criteria for limiting that and saying you can't? I mean, what if I'm just saying theoretically, I don't agree with Bethel on
Yeah.
their view of prophecy, but theoretically, let's
Yeah.
say that is a real thing. I mean, of course, prophecy is a real thing when defined properly, but to say that God could speak to you to say something to someone else, what if God wanted
Mhm.
to communicate to somebody that they're going to have a baby or that they should marry this or that person? So what
Yeah.
justification, I guess I should say, does Bethel use to say you can't speak those things?
Yeah, they would start with the idea of training wheels, and so Chris Valentin has given many of prophecy with dates and mates and babies. It's an interesting thing when you think about that, even that presupposition of laying out prophecy that way, because many of the prophecies in the Old Testaments were dates
Well,
and
that's what I was
mates
thinking. Yeah,
and,
there's a
and
lot
baby.
of very specific dates and things like
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. So they would argue that as a new supernaturally practicing Christian, you should stay away from those kind of things. Kind of the idea of like you're carrying a heavy sword, right? Like you don't want to be whopping this thing around and causing a lot of damage. So stick with something really simple, like an encouraging word, maybe something about a word of knowledge about some pain, maybe about they're like one of the common things they'd have you practice in the school of prophecy was like you sit across from someone. I was supposed to tell Kaylee, I would describe her room to her, her childhood room. And that would be a way of affirming how I got a word of knowledge. So they'd want you to stick with those things. They didn't have a biblical precedence for telling you not to. It was more of training wheels for first year students to make sure they didn't cause too much damage.
Okay. So one more quick question about the treasure hunts, because I had never really heard
Yeah.
about that or what
I'm
that was.
surprised.
So when you would, identify the ailment, how many
Mhm.
miraculous healings did you actually witness when you were doing treasure hunts?
Yeah, that's a great question. I could say hundreds, sure, but also I could say 0 because it's how much of it was like a lot of times Justin Peters says, is it psychosomatic? How much is it, you know, someone actually got healed or did they not? And this is something I still
Or
struggle
did
with.
they just want you to go away?
Yeah, there's also that.
Yeah,
Like,
there could be that,
just
yeah. Well, also
that
there's
was an actual,
adrenaline. Let's say
yeah.
somebody
That
wants
that's
to believe even that they could be healed, and,
mhm,
we're not talking about limbs growing or something that you can visibly see, but perhaps a pain in the back
mhm.
or a neck pain,
Right,
and there's a
right,
shot of adrenaline that can make that pain feel like,
right,
I mean, I've experienced this in my life too, where, you can be in a lot of pain, but then, like, something happens and you have an adrenaline rush and you don't feel that pain anymore, and you could easily
right,
think, "Oh, I was
right.
healed." And also I wanna be really clear for anybody listening. I'm not gonna speak for Jesse and Kaylee here. You guys can speak for yourself on this, although I'm pretty sure you would agree with this, that I'm not saying that God cannot heal today. I
No,
believe he can
Mhm.
no,
heal anybody he wants to, anytime he wants to. So we're
absolutely.
not arguing against God's ability to do miracles. And I think that's often what people hear when there's sort of some skepticism maybe at some of the miraculous claims.
Right,
No,
right,
certainly, obviously, our whole faith stands or falls based on a resurrection, the resurrection of Jesus being a real event in history. The Apostle Paul said, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is in vain and you're still in your sins. And
mhm,
I can honestly say I've experienced in my family a legitimate healing. So I
right,
know that God can
right.
heal. So we're not
Yeah,
saying he can't, but so
yeah,
often, what I'm concerned about is when I see videos of Bethel type people in that world going out onto the street and performing these miraculous healings. It's
mhm,
like even if you really want to believe, there's really not a lot of evidence, and I don't think it's wrong to put the burden of proof on the person making the claim, right?
yeah.
Mhm.
That's the and it's like there was like the idea of wanting you to leave. Like for instance, we would get daily or weekly updates because every Thursday was outreach day in first year. So every Thursday we'd have a list of businesses that we weren't allowed to go to because they'd be like, "Hey, we're tired of you guys coming here."
Mm,
So like there was a thing of people just want you to go. That's a totally a legit critique. And that's the thing I still struggle with this of like how many of those were legit healings and how many weren't. And if let's just say 50% were actual healings, well then I have to wrestle with, does God still work through people even if they have bad theology? And it's like
mm,
this trying to figure out where that line is. And so
yeah.
I don't like going down the road of discrediting, saying everything was false, everything was fake. But I do think it's a healthy critique to say, I don't know. I
Mhm.
don't
Yeah.
know, and it's a good honest, if we're gonna be honest about it, is like, yeah, a lot of them were like, "Yes, my back hurts every now and then," or, "Yes, I have a headache," or, "Yes, my knee hurts every now and then." Like, and so but then that counts as a student. It's kind of like when you are, like, promised a really awesome experience at a theme park as a kid, and you get there, and you're like, "This is nothing like the commercial."
Mm,
It kind of felt like that going to Bethel, where you're talking about all these amazing miracles you're going to see, and they talk about miracles, miracles, miracles. You're like, I'm ready. And then you do your first outreach, and someone with a headache gets healed, and you're like, wow, guys, we had our first miracle. And I'm like, wait a minute. Like I
yeah.
thought when we were talking about miracles, I was thinking like, I was going to see blind eyes opened on the daily and deaf
Right.
ears opened on the daily and stuff like that. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm so proud to partner with Foundation Worldview Curriculum, not only because I absolutely love this curriculum and it's one that we've used in our home, but it's the number one curriculum that I recommend when I'm out speaking at women's conferences. I'm commonly asked, what can I use to introduce my kids to topics like critical thinking, biblical worldview? And I always say, go to Foundation Worldview Curriculum. It's absolutely wonderful. And I love that they've just come out with a new one called God's Good Design. And this is for kids ages 4 4 and up. And it's 30 video-based lessons on God's good design for things like identity, gender, sexuality, marriage, and family. The lessons are really easy to implement. You just print the activity sheet and press play on the video. There's multiple activities per lesson that engage our kids' minds and bodies with biblical truth. And they're going to cover topics that you might be hesitant to introduce to your kids, sensitive topics such as gender, love, friendship, marriage, family, sin, transgenderism, abuse, pornography, and homosexuality, divorce, and redemption. And so when you use God's Good Design curriculum, your kids are going to walk away with a biblical understanding of what God's design is and why we should follow it. You get to be proactive in their approach to these topics rather than waiting to be reactive once your kids are exposed to sinful distortions of God's good design in their culture. So if you want to check it out, you're going to get 10% off of any family license from Foundation Worldview by going to foundationworldview.com. Use my code Alisa for that 10% off a family license. Again, that's foundationworldview.com. Use my code Alisa. Okay, so you go through Bethel, you graduate from Bethel, and then you kind of become a prominent worship leader in that world. Not necessarily, my understanding is did you lead worship at Bethel Church, or was it just more in that paradigm?
Yeah, so I was on the my third year was spent with the engineering team in the Soundhouse studio. So I was one of the assistant engineers on kind of the first round of Big Bethel albums that blew up. So Bethel Live, Jake Hamilton's live album, Jesus Culture Consumed, helped a little bit at the live at the Loft sessions. I was deep in that world, and so I got to really spend time with a lot of those people, which was great. I mean, honestly, I wouldn't trade it for anything. It was a wonderful experience, and from there, when I moved up to Washington State, we started connecting with people and met Kaylee, and they had a circles they ran with that also knew some great worship leaders. And so just kind of small world situation. And we started leading worship at lots of churches. And then that's kind of all kind of blew up.
Yeah, okay, good. So Kaylee, tell us your story of were you raised in a Christian home, and then what kind of, I obviously you guys met when Jesse moved to Washington, but kind of take us through the story up till there.
So I actually met on YouTube.
Oh, on YouTube. Oh, okay.
On YouTube.
All right.
We met on YouTube, then I moved to Washington.
Yeah.
Okay, that's right. I think I knew that. Okay.
Yeah. So my parents split when I was really young. So I grew up in two completely different households in general. So my mom was raised Buddhist and but wasn't practicing when she was raising me, wasn't pushy about any of that, but was very spiritual. And my dad remarried, and they were saved into a very hyper charismatic church where church was really, really loud, and really the emphasis was really, really on the gifts and speaking in tongues and falling out every single Sunday, getting the whole church to do that every Sunday. And I never went to Bethel, but
You had friends that went.
I did have friends that went, which is how I connected with him kind of.
Made sure it wasn't
after
crazy.
Meeting him on YouTube. Yeah. And then but I eventually moved in with my dad like halfway through high school to start on some college courses a little early, and then got really involved in a couple of different youth groups, and then one in particular that had a lot of connections with Morning Star Ministries and Bethel in particular, and they'd go to Jesus Culture every summer, the Jesus Culture Conference, and that's how I met Jesse in person. So he was working the Jesus Culture Conference. But
and you're a singer-songwriter too, right?
Yeah. It's hard to consider myself that when I've only written like a handful. Like I write one song every 5 years, maybe.
That's what I do. That's pretty much my MO too. I can't just like set up to, I'm going to write a song today. It just doesn't happen like that for me, but yeah.
Especially with small children. So yeah,
right.
It's few and far between a chance to do that. But, and I was going to say, I was thinking about the treasure hunting thing. So when we went to Jesus Culture, our youth group, and I think I only went twice. No, I think maybe I only went that one time.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think it was the year that I met Jesse at the Jesus Culture Conference, we had an opportunity to go. Well, you were kind of forced into going on a treasure hunt as people who were a part of the Jesus Culture Conference.
Yeah.
And there were places you weren't supposed to go because they would have been outrageous, just way too many people. And so I remember dreading this thing, but but for me, my spirituality, I should call it, was more like when I would write things on the page, or the group would get ideas about where to go, I was more about sensing a direction while it was happening and getting confirmation of like in this some universal spiritual connection. You know what I mean? And so I was much more emotionally driven about things. And I I think that really just comes from maybe the way I was raised, but maybe more just being affiliated in that spiritual world, but not really given any doctrine whatsoever. I had no theology. You could have told me that Jesus is a woman, and I would have totally believed it.
Wow.
Oh, you really had that encounter. Wow, that's amazing. He must be like, or something like that.
Yeah,
And I would have been totally like, wow, that's amazing, incredible, and I feel super connected to you. So yeah.
No, that's helpful. That makes a lot of sense because I think a lot of people probably relate with that, and I even relate with that on a certain level because there was a certain period of my life when I would say more charismatic than I am now. I'm still on a journey with that whole theology, trying to figure out what I think Scripture teaches on it because a lot of it is super confusing. I would not call myself a cessationist, but I've become very skeptical of the way the gifts are practiced, at least I would say, in the broader church and specifically at Bethel. So I grew up in a denomination that was charismatic, but the church I grew up in, they didn't do the falling down thing. You might have somebody say a word in tongues and then somebody would interpret it, but everything was pretty ordered. So I think that my perspective when I started seeing the Bethel stuff and the more hyper charismatic stuff was to be, even when I was more charismatic, to be kind of skeptical of that. But I definitely relate with what you said, Kaylee, because I was, I think, very much more mystical than I realized. And a lot of that was being driven by my own creativity and emotions, because I think I'm a very creative person. And I'm not saying that as a brag. I'm just saying that's just kind of one of my traits is creativity, and that can be used for good or evil. And I think that in my creativity, inventing things and even connecting emotionally with certain things, I mistook some of that stuff for the Spirit speaking or for something God might be leading me to do. And I also would say that I think there are times in my life when I felt the Spirit leading me, and it turned out to be something that was very, God-driven and scriptural and biblical, and that glorified God ultimately. So I'm still trying to figure a lot of that out, I'll be honest. But I relate with that a lot. So you guys meet on YouTube, and then you meet in person, and you fall in love. How did that go? Take us from that point in the story. Can you believe that summer is almost over? In fact, Labor Day is just around the corner, and my family is going to be grilling out top quality American-born, raised, and harvested meat from GoodRanchers.com. I love Good Ranchers because all of their products are sourced exclusively from local family farms. There are zero antibiotics or hormones. It's pre-trimmed, individually packed. It makes eating healthy so easy. And you also can trust Good Ranchers because they're totally transparent about where their meat is coming from. They are the place to get steaks, burgers, chicken, pork, and wild-caught seafood, and everything they deliver to your door tastes the way it should because it's raised responsibly and expertly cut and inspected for quality. So if you eat meat, you should be buying from Good Ranchers. Now, this Labor Day, they're offering an incredible deal. Subscribe to any Good Ranchers box now and get a free add-on for a whole year. So that's a full year of free plain chicken breasts, Angus ground beef, Applewood smoked bacon, or wild-caught Wild-Caught Salmon with every order. And if you use my exclusive code Alisa, you'll also get $25 off your first box and free express shipping. That's up to a $400 savings. So you can do a subscription or just a one-time purchase to try it out. But if you subscribe and use my code Alisa at checkout, you'll get $25 off your first box, free express shipping, and your free add-on for a year. And this is really great website that they have at Good Ranchers because it makes it really easy to pause your order or cancel your order. You don't have to jump through a bunch of hoops. Good Ranchers puts the power in your hands to pause, push, or cancel anytime because they're confident that you're going to love the product, and I'm confident too. So go to goodranchers.com, use my code Alisa to grab this Labor Day special and enjoy savings while also supporting American farms. Go to goodranchers.com, use my code Alisa, American meat delivered.
Pair of Toms.
Oh yeah, so it was at the Jesus Culture Conference. We had been talking a little bit through Skype and everything for like maybe a month or two before the Jesus Culture Conference, and had planned to meet, and he wooed me by buying me a pair of Toms, which, 2010, 2009. That was a big deal.
Yeah,
and so
sure.
I thought that was super weird, but also I was like, all right, maybe he's okay. And I think we long distance dated for about 9 months after that. And then he finally decided to move up to Washington so that we could do some in-person dating.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think we were engaged a year after that.
Just about, yeah.
And then we were engaged for a year. So, and then, yeah.
So you were, did you say you were engaged for a year and then you were engaged for a year, or you were just engaged for 1 year?
We dated in Washington for a year.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. And then engaged for a year.
For a year.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and then you got married. What's that?
I was saying I was just shaking my head because the 1 year engagement was just the worst idea ever.
Too long or too short?
Too long.
Way too long. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm for short engagements myself. Just get it over with. If you know you're going to get married, go do it. Yeah. So, okay. So now you guys end up leading worship together. Touring with people like Sean Foyt, who's risen to a lot of prominence in the last few years as a worship leader. Talk about that experience. And that was kind of in that Bethel paradigm. Would it be fair to say that in that same kind of theology and paradigm?
Yeah. So the youth group that I was a part of, as soon as he moved up to Washington, he quickly got involved in, we had kind of built like a worship, sorry, I use my hands a lot. We started kind of a little worship collective type of side community, based off of the musicians. Yeah. A parachurch community, I guess, based off of the youth group musicians who were also extremely creative and
talented,
trying to excel in that because of the connections to Morning Star and some of the older, the cool, hip, a little bit older young adults, I should say, at the time were attending Morning Star and were pretty high up there, very talented musicians themselves. And so we kind of started a little house project thing where we'd get together and just work on spontaneous songwriting and that's where
responsive listening, like how to play together, and
what also it was particularly to hatch what was in the atmosphere, what was in the spirit, out of our creativity on to try and attain a higher level of creativity, I guess, of better songwriting. I don't know. But it was a really cool experience, but out of that, we kind of formed like a traveling band, and Sean Foyt got in touch with, I don't know how they met, but in touch with our friends who were kind of like our overseers, youth group overseers at the time. And that's how we kind of became his traveling.
We became his go-to band in Washington. How it started. He would come to Washington, and whenever he had a conference there, or he had like an event, or a worship night, he would ask us to come play. And then he was really excited about our vibe and our sound because we did weird things.
We aimed to be different and unique.
So it's like we would have like micro Korg synthesizers and glockenspiels and toms and just trying like all
a melodica.
Yeah.
Wow.
all the accordion,
Yeah.
all that
I
kind
mean,
of.
it sounds
We just
cool.
were,
I'd like to hear that. That sounds
yeah,
pretty cool.
it was the whole
Yeah.
deal was like we weren't too worried about sounding perfect. It was more like, hey, we tried something new, and that was really fun.
Yeah.
Like,
Very experiential.
yeah,
Yeah.
and it struck a chord with a lot of people, especially in Seattle area, where people are always wanting to push the boundaries creatively. We just kind of really filled a hole that people were looking for in church, I guess.
Yeah.
And so when Sean came out, he would really like that, and so we started playing with him more. And then it got to the point where, he would come to the Northwest. And so we'd play in more of the Northwest areas. And then it was like, well, I'm going to Canada. You want to come with me to Canada? We'd go to Canada. And it's like, well, I'm doing a tour all the way down to the Fresno. You want to come? It's like, yeah. And so we do a whole tour. And then it just kind of kept growing and growing and
Yeah.
doing more and more things with them. So
Eventually, we went out to Harrisburg at the Heartbeat Conference, and
with the
we
Helsers and
met
all
the
that.
Helsers there. That was so exciting.
Yeah.
I'm
take
not
pictures with
familiar
these
with who
people.
that is.
The song
ABBA.
No Longer a Slave.
Oh yeah, that one.
Like,
Yeah.
no longer, I am a child of God.
Oh, yeah,
So
sure.
that's written by Jonathan. That's by the Helsers.
Okay.
Melissa.
Melissa. They're out of Morning Star Ministry, so to go all the way back.
Okay.
That's where John Mark McMillan came out of, who wrote How He Loves Us.
Okay.
David Villiers, even William Matthews of Bethel started out in Morning Star.
Okay, so
Morning
you
Star
mentioned, tell us the connection with Morning Star, because you mentioned Morning Star in conjunction with Bethel before, and I wasn't quite sure. So what's that connection?
Yeah. So Morning Star is kind of the East Coast version of Bethel, I guess you could say. It's kind of like if IHOP and Bethel had a kid.
Okay.
So they
I don't think they got very connected. Or
No.
maybe they did, but until recently, until the Helsers did the 18-inch journey, and that started really taking off. And I think there was an opportunity on both ends to connect in that way. And
they really push. They have a really amazing music program. So some of their teachers were very proficient. A well-known one is I'm sure you know Ricky Skaggs, the son, Luke and Molly, amazing musicians. They go to that church. Also people that we've got to meet and play with who are just incredible musicians and amazing people.
Yeah.
But they're all part of that Jonathan David Helser crew. And so the Helser signed on to be part of Bethel Music. And they released a couple songs.
There was also Kim Walker was a vocal student of Susie Arai. He was a big
prophetic worship leader.
Big prophetic worship leader with a big booming voice.
Morning Star.
Yeah.
And then
Morning Star.
he came back to Bethel. So there's like a lot of cross pollination there. And then Will Matthews was also at Morning Star before he went to IHOP, before he went to Bethel. So it's
Yeah.
So
that's helpful because, when you talk about IHOP, Bethel, Jesus Culture, Morning Star, these are sort of all affiliated within the same type of approach to music, to Christianity, similar theology, that kind of thing, kind of doing conferences together. It's very much what you would say would it be fair to say? Yeah, same green rooms, same movement, right? Same movement?
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's how we found ourselves in it, right? So like we would go over there and we'd meet them, and then like we got to connect with them. And then when Johnny and Melissa came out to Washington, they were doing a conference at one of our friends' churches, and then they asked us to open for them. So we had to come out and open for them, and it was really fun. So it's like, it's like the same conferences, same events, everything. So.
I'm so excited to tell you about a company that aligns perfectly with our mission and values as a podcast, but also all of us as Christians, and that is 7 Weeks Coffee, America's pro-life coffee company. They are on a mission to fund the pro-life movement 1 cup of coffee at a time. So why the name 7 Weeks? Well, at 7 weeks of development, a baby is the size of a coffee bean, and that's also the first time that a heartbeat is clearly detected on an ultrasound. And their mission is to support ultrasound services by donating 10% of every sale to pregnancy care centers across the country. But let me tell you about the coffee. It's honestly the best I've ever had. I'm really picky about what I put in my body, and not only does this coffee taste amazing, but it checks all of my boxes. It's mold-free, pesticide-free, shade-grown, low acid, and organically farmed. Plus, it comes from the top 1 to 2% of beans in the world. Here's another thing I love about 7 Weeks. They are fighting against child labor and farmer abuse by sourcing their coffee through direct trade. Now, this cuts out the middleman paying farmers directly and gives them 300% more than the requirements for fair trade. Fair trade is honestly a bit of a scam that just keeps farmers stuck in poverty, but direct trade sourcing allows for unmatched quality control and helps create prospering local economies, supporting farmers in places like Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Honduras, Brazil, Colombia, and Ethiopia. Now, mainstream coffee companies can't tell you who grows their coffee, but 7 Weeks can because they personally know all their farmers. If you've been on the fence, give 7 Weeks Coffee a try. Here's what you need to know. They are launching the Drink More Coffee, Save More Lives campaign, and that's exclusively for my listeners. So when you subscribe, you're going to get 15% off. But if you use the code Alisa, you're going to get an additional 10%. So that gives you a total of 25% savings on your first order. So join me in letting your coffee serve a greater purpose. Make the commitment to drink 7 Weeks Coffee every morning, and you'll be a part of funding the pro-life movement and helping to save over 5,000 lives and counting. Go to 7weekscoffee.com and use my code Alisa to unlock your savings. Again, that's 7weekscoffee.com. Use my code Alisa. So Jesse, when did your deconstruction start, and what were some of the things that you started to question that might have led you down that road?
Yeah, I like, just for point of clarity, because this is like we mentioned, we talked a little bit about this beforehand, but just like one of the things that most people, when you talk about deconstruction, it usually starts with like because you're angry or mad or hurt. And for us, it wasn't so much angry, mad, or hurt. Kaylee just got done listening to your book, and she was telling me about it, and
Oh man,
great
yeah,
job.
Oh,
it's really good. Yeah.
thank
Yeah,
you.
but you one of the things you talk about is how it's the trauma is kind of the fuse that kind of detonates it, how it starts. It's not really like the main thing, which is kind of how it was for us. Is that so? Like we were leading worship, we were at church, we were on staff at a church out in Washington State, and we were had our second kid, third kid on the way. And this is after 20 years of being in the charismatic movement of like seeing prophetic words and everything you can, like with some people they get a hype train and it's like it's amazing, but this is like you've ridden that train so many times, so now you start questioning, okay, what happens when
Yeah.
that doesn't go as planned, right? And so for me it started with the prophetic. That's like it always started with that, with, well, what do we do when prophetic words don't happen? And you see so many families that pack up and move and start a business because someone gave a prophetic word and then it doesn't happen. And then you're like, well, what do we do with that? Do we call up the prophet and be like, hey man, like I'm in dire straits here, what do I do? And usually it's like, well, no, you just didn't have enough faith. The person gets blamed. And so we started having questions about that. And also we just felt kind of like a emptiness to church, where like church just wasn't like the emotional high, just kind of, it's like a drug, it just doesn't hit the same after so long. And you keep chasing that high.
Mm.
And after doing everything we could do and trying so many different music styles and being creative, and it's like at one point you're just like, it's a formula and it's just not working on us anymore. And so we started asking questions, and honest questions, like about the prophetic and about like worship. And our pastor at the time really wasn't like, to your credit, and you did a great job in the book talking about how like leaders sometimes just don't even know what questions people are asking or what questions they need to ask. And so I don't want to blame them saying like they failed us, but there wasn't really any healthy dialogue as far as like what should we do or how do we handle this. And so at that point I just was kind of giving up. We read a book called Pagan Christianity, which I don't recommend.
Can
Because
let me pop in
yes,
here with that book, because
yeah,
when I left a church that kind of got swept up in some of this theology, one of the people that I was trying to walk with read that book, and that propelled
yeah,
them into a complete deconstruction and exit of the faith
right,
entirely. Um,
yes,
yeah, so
yes,
continue.
that's what did too. Yeah,
For us, well, Jesse and I have different stories when it comes to deconstructing.
yeah,
So for him, it was a lot of big questions about the prophetic and the gifts. And is that accurate?
yeah, yeah,
Um, I held on for a really, really long time. And so that book, all it did for me was,
kind of diagnose problems,
I
really.
was trying to diagnose, like, okay, is it my church leadership that's the problem? Is it the church altogether? Is it just the way we're doing church? Because I'm never feeling adequate.
Mm.
There's always something more I need to be doing,
Yeah,
in terms of like getting that emotional, the high, I guess, that I wouldn't have put it that way back then, but
Right.
now that's probably what I would equate it to. There was a high that I was seeking and that others were seeking as well.
Well, it was also just like that. It was when the buzzword of community was just being thrown on everyone. Find your community, find your people. And we're like, these are supposed to be our people, but we feel super distant from them. And then that book starts off with the first chapter talks about how it's a mad rush to get to church. And then you get there and you look at the back of heads of 200 people.
And listen to one guy talk the whole time.
So how is that supposed to build community? And we're like, you're right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is a valid critique.
Sure,
like, there's a lot of good critiques.
Yeah.
But yeah, it started with that. And then at that point, because I wasn't getting adequate answers, I eventually was just like, that book kind of sent me through a downward spiral. I actually started listening to, what kind of was the nail in the coffin actually was Derek Webb's album, Fingers Crossed. Derek Webb of Caedmon's Call.
Yeah.
He had a Deconstruction album, which is a gorgeous, musically, just a gorgeous album. And as a worship leader, creative, and then knowing his story,
Yeah.
that album just put so many words to like the struggles I was going through.
Yeah.
And so he came up with
Is that the album
podcasts.
that has the Tale of Two Divorces on it?
I don't think it has that one on
It's
it.
the one
Okay.
that's got alcohol. Is that what it's called?
It's called Spirit Bears the Curse.
Spirit Bears the
Yeah.
Yeah,
Curse.
yeah. But it tackles a lot of the questions like of predestination and of like, one of the lines he talks about how like if like he says, all my sympathy to Judas and the devil, they are yours in life and death as much as I. And you're like, oh, like, and he's saying it's like, I feel bad for the devil because he's a created being just as much as I am.
Mm.
And when you don't have the answers of how of theology and how to read the Bible, you agree with that wholeheartedly. And you're like, yeah, I am sympathetic for the devil right now. I am sympathetic for Judas because they got the short end of the stick. And when you have no answers for that, you just keep going and going down. And that's what I ended up with. And at that point, I just left the faith. But I didn't want to leave the church in a rough spot because their last worship leader left really quickly due to some life stuff, and they were really hurt by that. And so I didn't tell them I was leaving the faith, but I did tell them I'm stepping down as the worship leader. And I stopped taking a pay. I said, like, save the money, start looking for a guy. I'll give you, 6 to 9 months, as much time as you need. I'll keep fulfilling my obligations, but I just won't take a paycheck anymore.
Wow.
And so that's what we did. And they eventually found a guy. But I was essentially leading worship as an atheist.
Yeah.
I was like, I didn't. Yeah.
And
So.
I like to say, metaphorically, I held my foot in the door for a really long time, like as the door stopped, because he was way out the door and I was peeking my head in and peeking out all at the same time. And I was really waiting for things to change. I was really hopeful for more of this like creative collaborative that I was kind of promised, or as like maybe a last ditch effort of just trying to pull things together.
Yeah.
I was really interested in this creative journey with I don't know what to call it. It's hard for me to peg down. And I laugh because I'm awkward, not because I'm making a joke out of it.
Well, it was almost like more than the gospel, though. Like we weren't craving theology.
No,
we weren't craving biblical answers. It was this like fad of creativity and music and like you're saying.
I thought I was genuinely a part of something.
Yeah.
Like if I'm going to be really, really honest, it's weird to admit, or weird that I feel like I believed this at one time, but I used to believe that spiritual songs came on this like spiritual train, and if I didn't catch the train, it's kind of a workspace thing, then I would miss the song and somebody else would get this amazing song that was supposed to be mine. So there's a little bit of narcissism in there, attached to this uber spiritual life that I was supposed to be having, but was working so hard to maintain.
Yeah.
All of it based on just my feelings.
Well, and also, I mean, a side note though, just looking back on it, I never thought about this, but the thing that actually gave us most life in all of that was, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, was like the Enneagram. Like we were doing all kinds of Enneagram, like that was when we were like in the thick of it, of like, we were constantly being like trying to find more identity stuff. And like at the time, Sleeping at Last was putting out his podcast on each Enneagram type, where he would do a full-on episode about the type.
Yeah.
interview this really amazing Enneagram coach, and then he'd write a song about the Enneagram type.
Mm.
And I remember when 4 episode came out, Kaylee was just like in tears,
Mm.
and it was like this big moment.
I was critiquing it, of course,
But she was in
yeah.
tears about it. And then when the 8 episode came out, I was in tears. It was like, that was more like, I won't say gospel message, but that was like more life-giving to us than anything at the time, was
You know,
just feeling like we were being.
That's so feeling like you've been heard. That's really interesting because the Enneagram, I still have to think more about this, but there's so much of an overlap between Enneagram and deconstruction because I'm
Yes.
not saying that anybody who does the Enneagram is going to deconstruct. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying when people deconstruct, what they tend to do is the gospel that they sort of either pushed to the side or outright rejected gets replaced. You have to replace it with something. And very often I
Yep.
think that is the Enneagram because it's
Absolutely.
going to cause you to focus on yourself. And it's maybe you're going to feel, like you said, feel heard, you feel understood. Everybody wants to feel heard and understood. And
Yep.
so we are going to for sure look for counterfeit versions of that when we eschew the legitimate version of that, which is the
Yeah.
gospel and what the gospel has to say about God and the nature of man and all of those things.
Yeah.
So Kaylee, I want to ask you if you wouldn't mind sharing your story. I mentioned that last week I reviewed the book How to Raise the Dead about the theology of dead raising and how there are 60 plus dead. The book was written in 2011, so I don't know if this is still the case. But at the time the book was written, there were 60 dead raising teams that were available to come to the hospital and raise your loved one from the dead. And your family experienced this. And I think your story, I know it's probably hard to tell because it's obviously was very traumatic for you. But I think it might enlighten our viewers to the negative effects of bad theology because we've said on this podcast before, bad theology hurts people. Bad theology has victims. And you experienced this. And I want to thank you, first of all, for being open and vulnerable to share this story with us. But just take us through, and maybe you can also let us know if this played a role in your disillusionment with this type of theology and what ultimately led you out of the Bethel paradigm.
Yeah. So I think about a year after Jesse and I were married, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not even.
It
Only a
wasn't
couple months, I
maybe.
think. My brother Nathan, he was 15, almost 16 at the time. It was around Christmas time. There was some events that happened, had him at a friend's house, and he hit his head really hard, ended up in the hospital in the middle of the night with a really bad head injury. And we were called, did my dad call you? Or
Yeah.
Yeah, dad
We
called.
were working, and he called me. Yeah.
And I'm not sure of the events of that night really, except that we got in the car to go and pick up my dad and my stepmom, and weren't really sure what was going on until my stepmom got into the car, and it was, the world might as well have been ending. That was her behavior, was just, she was crying so hard, and
Rightfully so.
yes, and that was just a shock a little bit. And so on the way to the hospital, we were kind of preparing ourselves for like, this is bad. And so we get there and he's basically on life support in the hospital. And yeah, so my family had kind of, sorry, it's hard to,
It's okay.
I
Take your
don't,
time.
yeah.
We went right. They really went right into prayer mode. There was no delay. It was
You kind of there was a lot of like spiritual battling and warring about it, and
atmosphere.
And I was still very much in that same mindset, and but it felt very, very grim from the beginning. Like, I've never been in this deep with something like this. Like, I this was the real deal spiritual warfare kind of a thing, was my feeling. This was grim. So I think there were 6 days of just battling every way we could. We had connections with dead raising teams in Seattle. I think through kind of our leadership, our youth leadership, and the burn that we were a part of. I think that's how we were connected. It might have been a church affiliation somehow, but
we had a very quick prayer change
yeah, and
because of our networking and knowing people. We basically just sent the text out and
everywhere. It went
Yeah.
all over the place. So we had as many people as we could possibly think of praying for his resurrection. Really, we didn't believe him to be dead.
I got on all the Bethel forums and
Yeah,
all the alumni forums and
yeah,
blasted it everywhere there, and
yeah, and everybody was really praying, and it got to the point where we kind of like made it's hard. So we made the room kind of like a barrier, a space of protection, I guess.
hedge of protection for yeah.
Maybe of a place. This was a place. His hospital room was a place where no doubt could come in, because that was harmful to the amount of faith that we needed to get this job done, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And it was, to this day, that's the part that I struggle with the most with it all, because that, talk about the victims. It's not. My main struggle to talk about is that there were friends of my brother's who wanted to come in and who were really struggling themselves. These were
kids.
Yeah. 15-year-olds, 14, 15-year-olds. And they were coming in just in tears and were just really sad that this was happening. You have so many regrets and ifs, and if I had just picked him up that night, that's one of mine, or that kind of a thing. And they should have been allowed to come in, at least even just with tears in their eyes, but they were turned away, because we had to protect that space. And that is that in my mind, those are the real victims. And there's a part of our family too, I think, that we still can't talk openly and freely about what happened. The grieving process was, everybody just, everybody does their grieving process differently, for sure.
Yeah.
But there was no discussion whatsoever. It was not a healthy grievance from my point of view.
Yeah. Well, and let me read a quote from this book that I didn't read last week, because I think it will demonstrate that there really is a theology behind this. There is a way that people see God, a way people see death, that contributes to this idea. So here's a quote from the book, How to Raise the Dead, which, if anybody wants to hear my review, go back to last week's podcast. But it says this: grief is a sign that a person has accepted the circumstances as unchangeable, thus anticipating loss rather than a gaining of life. In other words, grief in the wrong context is a sign of unbelief. And so when you're telling people that to accept that someone has died is unbelief, and then to express grief over that is a sign of unbelief, to me is one of the most abominable theological paradigms you could tell somebody, because not only are you hindering their ability to actually, like you said, Kaylee, process their grief. These kids, I remember when my nephew died suddenly of a drug overdose, how important it was for his best friends they got in a car and drove from LA to Nashville, took them days. And they wanted to be the ones to carry his casket, to the gravesite. That was a part of their healing. That was a part of their grief, to be at the funeral. I forget what it's called. When you talk about death, it kind of makes your thoughts leave, doesn't it, when you've been through that? But they, to see the viewing of the body, and some, like you said, people grieve in different ways. Some wanted to go in and see him, and some didn't, and that was their way of processing. But it was allowed, and that's what I think is so important. If I wouldn't have been allowed to grieve, if my sister wouldn't have been allowed to grieve, or would have been gaslighted into thinking your grieving is some sign of unbelief or lack of faith, that is horrendous to me. So your family had a dead raising team come in, is that correct?
Yeah, eventually we did. I think it was after
day 5.
I think it was day 5 or 6. It took them a while. It took us a while to get in touch with somebody. And it felt like it was our last ditch effort after everything that we could do, really.
Yeah.
The hospital, of course, was like kind of trying to get us to take the next steps. That we had been seeing a grievance counselor. We had been, closed in a small room talking and trying to, they were really trying to get us to talk about what was happening next.
The
So
next steps,
yeah,
which no one wanted to talk about.
no, nobody
Yeah.
wants to talk about, and we weren't there yet. We weren't ready. They were supposed to be the ones who were experts at this, like they had supposedly raised the dead before, and they see this all the time. It's normal for them. And so in my mind, I'll speak for myself. I don't know what anyone else in my family was thinking, but for me, it was very much like okay, I can take a breath now. After doubting, like thinking maybe I'm the one in the room who's the problem here, and having to kind of excuse myself from the room, because maybe I'm the one who's not letting it happen, that kind of stuff. And then I kind of was like a little bit relieved to hear that, oh, they're actually sending somebody out. That's cool, because maybe then they have enough faith to carry this thing, because it was just feeling very, very heavy. And they gathered us all in the room. I think there were two guys who came in, two guys that I can remember. There might have been more. And one went to stand behind my brother in the bed, like not in the bed, behind his bed. And then another stood kind of next to him. And it just from the get started to feel like they were in over their heads. Like their faces were not collected as you would assume somebody with such confidence who's seen this before would have many times before even. And so I think I just kind of shut my mouth and just, we'll see where this goes. I don't know. And so they, after a lot of praying and feeling like, I don't even remember the prayers, because we had done a lot of declaring and what felt like warring, and just believing and believing and believing and just saying everything that we could to make it happen. That the guy who was standing behind him ended up saying, well, I just kind of sense after maybe an hour, maybe it might have been longer. Time gets weird. And so after maybe an hour, he was standing behind my brother and was just like you kind of could sense the room just kind of dulling down, and everybody just kind of losing belief, I guess. And so I think their way, this is what my best assumption is their way of kind of helping that process along to the next step, because they're kind of figuring, well, this isn't going to happen, maybe, was to say, well, I sense a spirit hovering over your brother, and I'm sensing him telling you that it's okay. That kind of a thing was alluded to. And yeah, there's beings in this room. There's so many angels in this room, and there wasn't any like, it's time to let go now.
Like,
it was
were they
very
saying that
spiritual.
your brother was saying it was okay? Is that what they were saying?
I don't remember them saying that, but I remember them
Someone said
kind
it
of,
was okay.
it might have been one of my parents. I don't know, but it was more like a spiritual, like, I'm not going to say it, but I'm going to kind of just set it on the table, like there's angels in this room just ready to welcome whatever's going to happen, or something like that.
It kind of felt
Yeah.
like, I mean, it's a terrible parallel, but it feels like at Bethel when a guy would break up with a girl and he would just say, well, I feel like God's telling us we shouldn't be together anymore. And it's like, that's not just let's be real with what's going on. It kind of had that same feeling of like we're going to lay out a spiritual reason with a clearly physical like objection. And just let that be their answer.
And then the huge guilt that I'll say that I felt, at least, of being allowed to feel relieved about that, because there were thoughts in my mind where I was like, if I were my brother, and if I saw God face to face and he was ready to welcome me, I would run to him. That's what my mind kept wanting to believe. And that's what I find peace about. But at the same time, there was this huge guilt of being like, I'm not warring anymore. That's wrong. That's the problem. I'm the problem. Oh, it's
Yeah,
brutal.
that is brutal. So what ultimate effect did this experience have on your faith? Did it cause you to question that theology, or is that maybe one of those poignant events in your life that maybe shifted your paradigm a little bit?
I was really angry for a little bit. But I think it really caused me to just shove a lot of things down and kind of cope for a long time with just being okay that I'm I'm a little it's hard to explain. I was angry and I remember shutting my friends out for sure, and anybody who wanted to comfort me, I just shut them out. There was nothing right that anybody could say, really, as I feel like there never is. But and there was I really there I just shut it all down. The next event really was his funeral, and then I went out. There were so many people there, and then oh my gosh, and then I'm probably thinking like maybe even like 500 people, maybe even like a lot of people, and then really just clamming up, just shutting it down, and then we went out to dinner, or I went out with my friends to lunch after that. I didn't spend time with my parents, and then the next week we were recording. And Sean Foyt called me and like talked about his dad and how he passed and how sad he was, and so he gave his condolences, which I really appreciated, and then asked me if I still wanted to record and he would understand if I didn't. And then,
well, be clear, we were recording an album with Sean Foyt.
His album. We were recording his album.
Yeah, so
and
we were the band for a live album he was doing out there.
Yeah,
and so
and I was more often than not his backup singer, and so he would give me verses to sing, and then whenever he needed a female vocal, we'd do it in that way. But I basically just had shoved it all away and said, yeah, I can do it. And we did the recording, and
As far as your faith goes, I mean, the thing I remember the most, it was that we didn't really have room theologically we like, it kind of felt like we were theologically orphaned a little bit because we didn't have any other theology to go to that would explain it.
I found an emotional way to console myself. Like, I didn't ever deconstruct in the way that I stopped believing in God. I didn't go that far. I always wanted to believe in God and that he loved me and that I was special and that he was there through everything, like the dark stuff, especially because I had a lot of dark stuff. But I never questioned his comfort for sure. And I just found ways to be good with that. So that's where our deconstruction is different, but
right. So you guys got to the point where, well, Jesse, you were leading worship as an atheist, and Kaylee, you had this horrific experience with that type of theology. So when they replaced you, Jesse, when they found the person did you guys just leave church altogether? Did you go to church anywhere? What did that part of the story look like?
It kind of fizzled out. I mean, like, we were trying at the time, we were going to a house church on Sunday evenings, which is the typical route. You go from leading worship all the time to just like, I don't want to be on stage at all.
Oh,
we were going to the house
when my brother died.
No. Oh yeah. So your timeline, just so you know, your time, those events are very far apart.
Yeah.
So
okay.
They're probably a good 7-8 years apart.
Oh,
those
okay,
two events.
got it. So you went on for several years after that. Continued on with Bethel.
Yeah, and a few different churches. We
Yeah.
were leading worship in those, and I was doing graphic design and working at churches in that way. And then
Yeah.
we were just kind of being young and married and
Making coffee.
trying to figure things out, but what our
Yeah.
next move was. And then we moved out further west
Yeah.
and got involved pretty heavily with a what I would say is a hyper charismatic church with a little more emphasis on um, help me, what would you call that?
Like they were really big on spiritual warfare
Yeah.
and all
Mhm.
kinds of stuff. And
Like deliverance, that kind of stuff.
Deliverance,
deliverance
yes.
ministry, yeah.
A little bit of dominionism.
A lot of dominionism.
Yeah.
But yeah, so like at that point though, I mean, to answer your question, we were leaving the church once they found their replacement, for lack of better terms. We kind of had our sending off service, as do most worship leaders, like, no, they're leaving us and whatnot. But for us, it was kind of a hard send off. It wasn't really it wasn't the hurrah we were like, the fanfare we were hoping to get. It was almost a passive aggressive sermon,
Oh,
which kind of stunk, but that's neither here
yeah.
nor there.
And that
Yeah,
it was
that almost did you more dirty than anything.
that I was waiting to be let down, I think, by leadership, and that really just kind of was the nail in the coffin for me that finally got me out the door.
Hmm. The passive
Of
aggressive
church,
sermon, or
yeah,
church in general, of
Yeah.
like, ooh, we're really doing this wrong if they're allowed to use the pulpit that way.
right?
And
Sure.
that and then I was almost I was almost able to say, no, surely he's not talking about those people over there. And then when it felt like it was more pointed at me after a couple times, I was like, okay, no, I can't be here anymore. And
Yeah.
that was really what it was.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, we
Yeah.
left that, and then
Yeah.
we were doing a house church for a little bit, and then I got to the point that's where I was like, I can't do anything lightly. I'm a whole hog kind of person, so for me it was like, if we're gonna do atheism, let's do atheism. And so it was, I didn't want to just entertain the idea. I wanted to do life with it. So like actually construct a worldview and actually justify what I believe. And then would just be like the high school atheist and be like, you believe in God? That's stupid.
Right.
I wanted to actually like have so I read Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins and listened to their books and their podcasts and how do you justify morality. And I went through that for almost a good year or so of just like really trying to find my footing as a worldview in atheism. And it was dark.
our marriage did suffer.
Yeah.
There was a lot going on. There was a lot hormonally for me, and just the way that we treated each other out of just our individual struggles,
Yeah.
and trying to figure out what we were doing, feeling very lost and very abused and very abandoned. Yeah, just a lot of hurt. And then
also with nowhere to
what do we do with all of this?
Yeah, it's like usually you have like some sort of spiritual leader or someone like mom or dad, but then like when you have no one to relate to, you just kind of end up turning to, and that's where like honestly, I mean, to bring it full circle, that's where the Enneagram kicked in a lot, because it felt like something.
It felt like a diagnosis for
our problems. Honestly,
Yeah,
it was
for,
like
for
problems.
the bend on our struggles.
Mhm.
Like, oh, here's how I fix that a little bit,
Yeah.
instead of really examining like, why am I struggling this way?
Mhm.
Yeah.
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 So what led
So-
you back? What happened? Like, you're living as an atheist, you're reading Sam Harris. What happened?
Yeah. I mean, it was a just as much as a slow phase out as it was a slow phase in. So it wasn't like I just flip the switch and be like, all right, I'm a Christian again.
Mhm.
One of my best friends, still my best friends this day, we went on a hike, and I remember he's if you watch this, I hope he sees it. He's what he calls himself a militant agnostic. And what that means is he says, I don't know who God is, and you don't either.
Mhm.
Like he's very much of like, no one knows, and that's
Yeah,
okay.
sure.
And so I was also listening to a lot of Jordan Peterson at the time. He was just starting to get a little bit of social media, and I was fascinated by his thinking process. And
Mhm.
before he even was doing anything with Daily Wire or any of those channels, he had hundreds of hours of content on his YouTube page. And they were just his college lectures. And I never went to college. But I've always been an avid learner. And so for me, I'm like, I'll just listen to his stuff. And he had a whole series on Exodus and on Genesis. And and how do you justify morality, and then Nietzsche and the man, how do you find man's meaning, and Dostoevsky, and I'm just like consuming it all, right, trying to figure out, okay, where do I land on this? And I'm agreeing with him, but I can't subscribe to what he's saying because he never says it. But I'm like, well, everything you're saying has an ultimate, so you have to believe in some sort of God. But I don't.
Mm.
I'm an atheist. I don't believe in God. And then he was asked the question in an interview of like, well, do you believe in God? And in true Jordan Peterson fashion, he like, he's like, what do you mean by believe? And what do you mean by going on? And but he answers it by saying, I live my life in such a way as if there's a God I'm going to be held accountable to. And that for me was just enough skepticism grounded with rationality that I could dip my toe into that. Because it wasn't saying there was an ultimate, but it did give me at least footing to say there is something higher than me that I can appeal to justify an ultimate morality. As an atheist, you can't do that. And and I'm not trying to strawman atheists. Like, trust me, I tried for a year.
Mm-hmm.
I was trying to, not that I figured out atheism in a year, but like that was one of the things I constantly struggle, especially when you're raising kids and you're trying to explain to your daughter you shouldn't hit your daughter or hit your sister, and they ask why, and you're like, well, that's a good question.
Yeah.
why shouldn't you hit your sister? And you try to justify all that. So I started with that, and I just kind of kept trickling in, and eventually I came across, I've always been into cults. I've always been into studying cults, and Scientology was one of the biggest ones I still am fascinated by. And I started learning more about Mormons and Latter-day Saints and Jehovah's Witnesses, because I kept having them appear at my door. So I'm like, okay, what do they believe? I started looking stuff up, and I came across Jeff Durbin doing street ministry to a Mormon, and it was fascinating because he would ask the Mormon a question, the Mormon would answer, and I'm trying to listen to this not as a Christian but as a bystander, like a non-biased bystander. But like I'm naturally trying to think of my own answer, and I'm finding myself agreeing with the Mormon with his answers. And I'm like, wait a minute. I thought these guys were crazy and in a cult. But they would give an answer, then Pastor Jeff in his most humble response would pull a scripture out. And then I started listening to a bunch of these, and I come to realize, I was like, maybe I was never a Christian, because everything that I'm justifying my beliefs with, or how I would answer those questions, this guy's telling me isn't even Christian. And so then I'm like, well, what kind of Christian is he? And I found out he's a Reformed Baptist. So I'm like, well, let me get more into the Reformers. And I started studying historic Christian, very similar to your story of like, let's get back to just basics.
Yeah.
Let's
What
just
is
start
this
with
thing? Right.
Yeah. And that's what kind of got me going. And at that point, I'm like, all right, I'm pretty sure I'm a Christian at this point. And in the midst of all that, there's also all the Wake Up Olive stuff, and more Bethel stuff was happening.
And we hadn't been going to church for 2 years at this point.
At all. Oh, and she was wanting me to lead the family. She was like, we should do Bible study. I'm like, we should find a guy that can do that.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not that guy, because I don't know the Bible.
There was a lot of disconnect between him and I in general, because I was still very much a believer, but knowing that people had let me down.
Yeah.
And just really doing a lot of waiting on him to kind of figure that out, because I also admittedly am quite the follower. And so I wanted to maintain my belief, but at the same time still had no idea what, like, I couldn't name any tenets. Like, I don't know what I believed in. All I knew was that there's a God, and he exists, and he loves me. And that's all I got.
Yeah. Well, also we were every time we thought about it, like the thing that we had to keep, I think for me it was easy to let go of, but the final straw for her, when we were looking at like Reformed theology or historic Christianity, or like when we watched the first American Gospel film, we watched that. That was one of the first things. Like, we had a friend who watched it, and then she's like, you should watch it. And I'm like, all right. So we watched it together. And that was that, scene you talked about where I was ugly crying, where it was just like, we just sat there after watching that first film of trying to realize, okay, like there's a lot of like, cause it's just a lot of work to redo theology. Like,
yeah, it is. Yeah.
It's a lot of work. It's not like, I like using the comparison of like, you can walk in a park, you can climb a mountain, right? Like, a walk in the park, you're walking, but it's the same familiar thing. It's easy. You know what's going to come up. You know it's going to be there, but you have the same view all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But reworking your theology is like, it's climbing a mountain. Like, when you climb a mountain, like, you're tired, you're exhausted. You're like, why am I doing this? This is stupid. I could be at the park. But then once you crest the skyline, and you're on that ridge, you're like, oh, that's what I was missing. Like, you get it.
Yeah.
And that point from base camp to the ridge was a long trek for us.
How long was
And there's a
that, do you
lot of,
think?
I mean, for me, a total of like probably 5 years, 4 years.
Yeah.
For Kaylee, probably closer to a year,
Mhm.
because
I was really lax with,
yeah,
like, I was never really given a good foundation other than just my feelings. And so, like, I was very, I didn't have much conviction outside of like, no, I'm definitely spiritual. Like,
yeah.
I feel God's closeness, therefore he is. And um,
I felt I had this experience, so God must be real.
yeah,
And
God,
that was the
yeah.
thing that you had to, I, not to interrupt, but that was the thing, that the last straw for us was really giving up the prophetic, and having to then, like, it was therapeutic to go back and look at, like, okay, we've had nights where we led worship together for like 4 hours, where we'd be like, from 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. leading worship. And it's like, okay, that was a sincere moment, but how much of that was unhealthy and bad theology?
Mm.
Yeah.
Like,
I think
Yeah.
we're still definitely uh like battling through that a little bit. At least I am, because so much of the emphasis for me and my identity was on my ability to create and
Mhm.
be really creative in my worship, and that was my contribution, and my that's how I connected with God in so many different ways.
yeah,
Mhm.
Which is just, but there was no foundation whatsoever other than
feeling.
just feelings.
Yeah.
And that's what the first American gospel was,
Mm.
for me, was really confronting that you're just feeling this, there's nothing else, that you can't just believe something and say it is and then it is.
Yeah.
That's not how Christianity operates.
Well,
Yeah.
what's interesting is, I've shared that I helped lead worship at a church that kind of subscribed to this theology. I was an artist in residence at a different church that wasn't really all that influenced with the NAR Bethel paradigm, but my home church was. That I just didn't realize it at the time. But as a part of the worship team, I so relate with what you just said, Kaylee, because one of the things that really started me kind of questioning that paradigm was when it was, I think it was even like a Babylon Bee post or something, where it said like Holy Spirit waiting in the foyer, to the music gets really ramped up to make his big entrance, something like that. And I remember
Till the
laughing
floor
at it
times
like,
hit.
oh, what's that?
Till the floor times hit.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
painful.
Yeah. And I remember seeing it and laughing and going, oh, that's funny, but they don't really get it. But the more I thought it through, I'm like, but is that what I think? Like the Holy Spirit is just like waiting for the music to get good and to get everybody all warmed. And so that I think is what caused me to start questioning that paradigm, because I definitely felt like I, like you, Kaylee, I loved the Lord. I deeply. In fact, this was even after my faith crisis when God rebuilt my theology in so many ways, and I made so many course corrections, but I still was chasing, I think, that emotional high in the beginning of that process. It's been, 8 years or so since this whole thing happened, but and it was like the letdown when you wouldn't have the high, or the letdown when you didn't have that experience. And it was just like this hamster wheel that was so exhausting to me. And I think when I realized, God is, when I sing How Great Thou Art, or I sing Amazing Grace, or I sing one of the great hymns, God is worshiped whether I feel it or not. And I declare truths about God, whether I feel it or not. And to me, that is so
Yep.
much freedom. It is so much
Yep.
freedom to know that I don't have to like stir something up, conjure something.
Yep.
And I know you guys have expressed things like that as well, Jesse, especially with you, kind of leaving that paradigm. We've really gone long here, but is there anything you'd want to share with our viewers? I suspect there might even be people watching that, like me, might be in churches that aren't overtly Bethel influenced, but maybe
Yeah.
they, there's some of that they don't realize.
Yeah.
What would your word for them be?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm coming across this a lot in a lot of my discussions, just with friends and, fellow believers, that are bringing up a lot of this stuff of, like, they'll bring up a revivalist who was known for all these things, and it's like, are you saying all that's bad? Like, all those are false conversions, or that's false worship, or how do you work with that? And I think what's helped me a lot is that when we have something like, let's just say Bethel, that's so prevalent with that's just everywhere. I mean, it's everywhere. It's in K-Love, it's on YouTube, it's Spotify. They're like breaking records across the board, and they got their finger in everyone's pie. They're like,
Yeah.
they're everywhere. And so it can feel like the 80s satanic panic witch hunt
Right.
of like, it's like, that's got it on there. Don't do that.
Right. Right.
And there is, I think there's a good thing to that. But I think the one thing I would say to that is God can work through these things in spite of them, not because of them. And
Mm.
so, which has helped me kind of wrestle with where like you have someone like a great example would be someone like Bill Johnson or like Heidi Baker, right? Who's like Heidi Baker runs Deep with Bethel. She's a missionary out in Zimbabwe. She'd come to BSSM all the time. She's got an amazing ministry where she's building hundreds of schools for orphans, and she's got an incredible heart, but she also has some of the most craziest theology ever. And so there's this constant battle I'm having to go with, and I know other people are too, where you're like, but look at all the good stuff they're doing, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, what do you do with that? Like, is it Matthew 15, Matthew 18, where it's like, we cast out demons in your name. We did all this stuff in your name. And he's like, depart from me, you never knew me. It's like, is it that situation? Like, I have a hard time wrestling with that, but I keep going back to God can do things in spite of that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, cause he's God. So in spite of all the bad theology, yes, things can happen. But I keep thinking about the passage where Paul's talking about just because where sin abounds and grace abounds even more, does that mean we should sin more so grace can abound even
Right.
more? He's like, no. And so just because there's good fruit sometimes from bad theology, does that mean we should just keep having bad theology? No. Like we need to
Right.
correct it.
That's good.
It's
Yeah.
like we do need to correct it. But in spite of the bad theology, yes, God can do things, and yes, things will happen, and yes, lives will be touched, and yes, even some people will get saved. But
Yeah.
does that mean we just ignore the bad theology? It's like, well, no, it still needs to be addressed. But I don't know. I don't know if that
That's
makes
a good
sense,
word.
but it's
Yeah. That's a good word. Kaylee, do you have any word for our viewers?
I keep thinking about sorry, my words.
Words are hard sometimes.
Words are really hard sometimes for me. Oh. I just keep thinking about like our feelings lie.
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
and
hard and deceitful.
the heart is wicked and deceitful. And I used to be able to sing I'm a Little Teapot on a worship stage, and people would go crazy over that. And L is for the way you look at me. I could sing secular songs and love songs to him all day long, thinking that was my intimate relationship with God, and that he was singing those things back to me. And I it's hard to say without feeling like I'm being so brutal, but like we have to really examine the aspects of what we're worshiping.
Mm.
And I if I'm going to be brutally honest, even just on myself, I think a lot of that was my own worship of an idea that I had about who God was and what he wanted from me, what he wanted to hear. And a little bit of putting myself up on that pedestal of being like, I have access to something that nobody else has access to because I'm unique and special in him. Gets a little bit narcissistic. And so I think we just have to be careful with what does our creativity look like? And I'm still mulling it over, but what is my contribution? And if I'm trying to attain whatever this idea that Bethel has, what they represent, like they've got this creative thing and they're doing music different and big and emotional, and they look so spiritual doing it, and they do it in this they think they're being humble.
Mm-hmm.
But from being on that pedestal and being one who was a part of a group that people were so excited to hear play, and like we had a mantle, we had something that we could give to people. I'm the thing that I want to tell the people that are thinking they need to seek outside of their own groups to find that thing, or they're missing something. It's such a lie. Like it is something that's been put on this pedestal that's a false idol,
Mm-hmm.
really. It's an idea about something that just isn't true.
Yeah.
So
That's powerful.
that's what I have.
That's good. Well, I want to thank my guests, Jesse and Kaylee Westwood. So appreciate them being vulnerable to share their stories. If you're watching on YouTube, it helps if you subscribe and then click that bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. If you're listening on audio platforms, helps us out so much if you go leave a great review, and always comment on social media, click like, share it, send it to your friends, whoever you think this message would help. And as we pursue Christ, let's remember to keep a sharp mind, a soft heart, and a thick skin. We'll see you next time.